Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. When life's problems get the best of you, sometimes all you want to do is escape and start anew. This was the case of Steven Callahan, a 29-year-old man who had just separated from his wife after a rough marriage. Wanting to distance himself from the environment and people he was used to, Steve went on to build a boat for himself, sailed away into the ocean and found solace in his isolation in the middle of the deep blue seas. However, going on a sailing adventure isn't all calming and soothing. Rough seas battered and severely damaged his boat, and he was left to himself in the middle of the ocean. This is his horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. Steve has always dreamt of touring the world in his self-built boat. He left for England in 1981 from Newport, Rhode Island to run away from the life he knew and the problems that came along with it. He felt that sailing solo would be a perfect way to start fresh with a new chapter of his life as a single man. So aboard his 21.3-foot-long boat named Napoleon Solo, he smoothly sailed across Bermuda and was able to dock at the port in Cornwall, England. He departed England with a group of sailors in a solo race to Antigua. However, he decided to back out of the race when they reached Spain as Napoleon Solo got damaged by the huge waves along the way. Steve was forced to spend a few days in Spain to repair his damaged boat. As soon as Napoleon Solo was ready to sail again, he ventured into the seas again and went on his way to the Canary Islands for a quick breather. After a few days, on January 29, 1982, Steve once again boarded Napoleon Solo and started sailing his way to Antigua, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The weather was perfect and the journey was smooth sailing on his first week. However, around 800 miles into his journey and onto his second week, the weather conditions drastically changed and huge waves started slamming onto the boat. Being an experienced sailor, Steve had anticipated such scenarios, so the sight of the rushing waves was anything but surprising for him. The waves were huge and rough, but that didn't seem to bother him at all. When night came, he even turned the boat's autopilot mode on and started lying down to sleep, while the waves continued to batter Napoleon Solo. He was already half asleep when suddenly, a loud bang awakened him, and waters quickly rushed into the boat. Something had slammed the boat badly. It was unclear what it exactly was, but what was apparent was that it broke the boat's hull. In a matter of seconds, the boat was already sinking fast as Steve gasped for air trying to keep his head above the water. He knew it was going down, and if he wasn't going to move fast, he was definitely going down with it. Fearing for his life, he rushed outside the boat on the deck and started untying the life raft. He grabbed it and threw it overboard onto the raging sea. To his horror, as he pulled the line, the life raft didn't inflate. He pulled the line a second time and the raft still remained deflated. Anxious and running out of time, Steve was getting frustrated, and the boat was now almost fully submerged. He kept pulling hard until finally, the raft puffed up, floating on the rough waters. Steve pulled it closer to himself and went inside the raft. He was now safe from sinking deep into the sea. However, before he could even cut off the line connecting the raft to the boat, the thought that immediately crossed his mind was how he was going to survive in the raft in the middle of the ocean. He had nothing else but the raft and the pocket knife on his hand. With his survival at stake, Steve was left with no other option. He dived into the flooded boat to where his emergency bag was stocked up. As soon as he got to it, using the knife on his hand, he cut the rope that secured the bag in its place and began swimming back towards the deck. When he reached the entryway, it was then that he realized he's locked up inside. The hatch leading to the deck was slammed closed and the water from both sides of the hatch made it hard for Steve to push open. Right at that moment, Steve felt like it was the end of his life. In a matter of seconds, the boat will completely submerge and bring him down to the bottom along with it, trapped and helpless. Just when he thought all is lost, a huge wave slammed at the boat. Its impact caused the hatch to suddenly flip open, and out emerged Steve gasping for air. He swam quickly to the raft and climbed up inside with his emergency bag in tow. As soon as he was inside the raft, he immediately cut the line that tied the raft to the boat, and watched as the boat completely submerged into the deep waters. The rest of the night inside the life raft was nothing less than terrifying. He was soaking wet, the huge waves raging against his life raft causing intense rocking, and the strong winds making the conditions worse. He was cold and shivering. The thought of dying of hypothermia quickly sunk in and scared Steve. When morning came, the waters had already calmed down, and the scorching heat of the sun dried him up. It was then that reality dawned on him. He is now drifting alone in the middle of the vast Atlantic Ocean with clear horizons, not a single sign of land nearby, just purely the sight of deep blue waters. With no way to seek help, and with his family back home not expecting to hear from him in the next 5 weeks or so, there was no chance of rescue for Steve. Using manual calculation methods, Steve realized he was roughly around 1,000 miles away from land, and was being pushed by the winds toward the west. The closest chance he could get was to be able to reach the shipping lanes in the Atlantic Ocean, hoping a ship could spot his life raft. He had estimated that the lanes were 350 miles away from him, toward the west. However, to be able to reach that point, the unpredictable wind must push his raft steadily in the same direction it has been pushing it thus far. At the rate at which he is currently drifting, it would probably take around 2 weeks to get there. Until then, the question is whether his supplies could last him that long. The supplies he was able to secure from the emergency bag included 8 pints of emergency drinking water, which could probably last him 8 days, a few emergency food packs, a small spear, and 3 solar stills. Now, solar stills are emergency water purification kits that can be filled with seawater and made to float on the sea to be directly under the heat of the sun. The heat of the sun would be absorbed by the black material beneath, causing the pure H2O to evaporate and leaving the salt and other minerals behind at the bottom of the solar still. Its vapor will then be caught up in the clear plastic covering that will eventually condense into droplets. When these droplets trickle down the clear plastic, they are caught up in the collectors all around the sides of the solar stills. The water collected will then be safe for drinking. Steve had exactly the right tool to keep him hydrated and survive a little longer, in spite of being alone in the vast sea. However, his problem was he didn't exactly know how to use it. In his first attempt to collect water, he was able to quickly gather a whole bag of water after half an hour. At the sight of it, he quickly grabbed the bag and excitedly drank it, but just as the water touched his taste buds, he immediately spit the salty water out. It was still just seawater. He tried and tried a few more times but still failed to gather pure drinking water. Night came and another storm battered his life raft. It was his first full night in the raft. With rain pouring down non-stop, another idea came to mind. Having heard of a lot of survival stories, where survivors used rainwater to get them through, he decided to gather and catch the rainwater from the canopy of the life raft instead. When he was able to gather enough, he immediately drank it, but also spat it out again within seconds. It tasted like vomit. The canopy's orange pigment contaminated the water, making it undrinkable and toxic. With only the few pints of drinking water he had, he tried to survive the next few days by drinking water from his emergency pack in very small amounts, hardly even swallowing them. On the 7th day of his ordeal, despite strictly minimizing his consumption, he was down to his last sip of drinking water. The solar stills were all that he had left. Out of desperation, with roughly a week to go before he could get a chance of rescue at the shipping lanes, he had to figure out a way to make the solar stills work. Determined to survive, he tore open one of the solar stills apart in a drastic effort to understand how it actually works. He then realized he had to inflate the solar still at just the right amount, and immediately tried it out on the second still he had. He managed to gather a spoonful of water, drank it, and finally he no longer had to spit it out. He felt ecstatic. He now was able to successfully produce small amounts of drinking water. But the next problem was he was already out of food, and it was just day 7. By day 11, out of extreme hunger, it was only then that he realized he could use the small spear to catch fish from his raft. However, it wasn't as easy as it sounds. He struggled the whole day trying to spear a fish, and before he could even catch one, the firing mechanism of his spear gave up on him. Now he had to make do with a range of 18 inches, instead of 6 feet. For the next few days, he kept trying despite the limited range that he had, only able to try catching the fish directly in front of his raft. Day after day, he failed to catch a single fish. He felt extremely frustrated, feeling that he just wasted his life away. Yet despite his depressing situation, he kept trying. Come day 14 on his life raft, after countless attempts, he was able to successfully catch his first fish. He sliced it into pieces and ate it raw, finally filling his starving stomach. With food and a steady source of water, he knew he could survive this horrifying ordeal. His high hopes of surviving didn't last that long. That night, as he was enjoying the supposedly calm seas, he heard a huge fish flopping underneath his raft. As he looked over to the side, suddenly out of nowhere, a huge shark bumped into his raft, slightly lifting it above the water after such a powerful impact. The shark profusely attacked the raft, bumping it again and again in full force. Right then and there, Steve thought that this was really the end. It's either the shark eats him alive or it rips his raft into pieces, or both. Either way, he would end up dead without anyone else knowing. So, he mustered up the courage and started hitting the angry shark with his spear. He fought for his life, until unexpectedly, the shark started veering away from the raft and didn't come back. A great sense of relief overtook Steve and kept him awake all night. Not long after, as he stared at the dark horizon, he suddenly caught sight of something. Right before his eyes was a ship over the distant horizon. Excited, he quickly grabbed his flare to catch the ship's attention. He felt like it was slowly approaching his direction and thought surely this was the end of his 15-day ordeal. As he celebrated and shouted with joy inside his raft, the ship came closer and closer until it just passed by. The ship's crew didn't notice him at all. In just a blink of an eye, the extreme sense of victory he felt turned into utter disappointment. He knew based on experience how extremely hard it is to spot something in the middle of the vast ocean, more so, something that you're not even looking for at all. In the 10 days that followed, Steve saw a number of ships pass through, and every time, he would try giving everything he's got to catch the crew's attention, lighting up flares in the night. However, not a single ship noticed his distress call and his raft was starting to drift past the shipping lanes. Just like that, the little hope that remained was slowly fading away, and for the first time, he broke down and cried. His next chance for rescue was another 1,000 miles westward, in the Caribbean Ocean. He was on the verge of completely giving up, yet somehow, the will to live prevailed. With his last slices of fish on day 43, the hungry and already very skinny Steve went back to catching fish. After a few hours of waiting and trying, he was able to spear a fish, but the sudden jerk of the big fish broke it loose and pulled the end of the spear along with it. Now Steve was left with a broken spear, and to make matters worse, the big fish swam through below the raft, poking a hole on the bottom tube of the raft as it went along. Within seconds, Steve heard the sound of air escaping from the tube, eventually completely deflating the bottom tube. This made the raft not only unstable, making it impossible for Steve to stand steadily and continue catching fish, but it also slowed down the speed at which it was drifting. In the next 10 days or so, Steve focused his efforts and energy into patching up the hole. He stuffed it with anything he could possibly find and tried to inflate the raft. However, bubbles of air coming from the hole just proved it wasn't going anywhere. At that moment, he finally gave up and just started reflecting on his life. He was on the verge of death, alone in the middle of the ocean. After some time, he eventually snapped out of his depressive state and regained the will to live. He scurried through his emergency bag looking for something that could be useful in repairing the hole. Then suddenly, he realized he could use the fork to close up the improvised patch. When he pumped the manual inflation tube, he felt overwhelming joy as he saw the bottom tube inflate fully into its original form. But his ordeal was not over yet. He had a few hundred miles to go before he could reach the Caribbean shores, and on day 66, his last solar still gave up on him. It had reached the end of its useful life, with its bottom all rotten out. With only 3 bottles of water left from the emergency bag, Steve's mental state starts to get worse. He starts seeing faint images of other people who've also been lost at sea, died and never found again. His body was almost shutting down on him. What's left of the water was his last lifeline, and his mind started tricking him into gulping all of it. As he lay down with little to no energy left, Steve was awakened by the sound of plastic bottles bumping onto the raft as it floated on the water. He knew this was a sure sign of civilization nearby. True enough, as he looked up, he saw from a distance an island. Just the sight of its greeneries gave him once again a glimmer of hope. A little while later, he heard the sound of a motorized boat steadily approaching him. 2 local fishermen spotted him and brought him to land, interestingly just 60 miles down south of Antigua, his intended destination. It had been day 76 of his life on the raft, and after everything, he could now finally step foot on land. Steve's weight drastically dropped to 100 pounds. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital before he could fully recover. As Steve would put it, the world's biggest desert is the ocean. It's ironic how you're surrounded by such a vast body of water, but in reality, you couldn't drink any of it. Yet despite all odds going against him, his 76 days adrift in the Atlantic Ocean were never wasted. In fact, in 1986, Steve used this horrifying ordeal and authored the book, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, which earned its spot in New York Times bestseller list for more than 36 weeks. Thank you for making it this far. If you liked this video, please click on the like button and subscribe to our channel. Let us know what you think about this episode in the comments below. Again, thank you, and see you on the next one.